Hello, I'm Josh Tyson, co-author of Age of Invisible Machines, the first best-selling book about conversational AI. Age of Invisible Machines explores the learnings of industry veteran and OneReach.ai CEO, Robb Wilson. Each week, Robb and I bring in a guest to continue the conversations we started in the pages of our book. This week on the Invisible Machines podcast, we're talking about why successful knowledge management rarely gets the credit it deserves, how ironclad engineering can't protect against human error, why engineers need specific training around ethics, and a culture change at NASA that was enabled by lean knowledge management. Our guest is Roger Forsgren, former Chief Knowledge Officer at NASA. Having worked his way up from a mechanical engineering position, Roger has a unique understanding of maintaining the administration's renowned gold standard of data management in extremely high-pressure environments. His book, Lean Knowledge Management: How NASA Implemented a Practical KM Program, is a great resource for anyone who is fascinated by the poetry of data organization, retrieval, and maintenance. We've also got a special guest host for this episode, Mike Lee, who you might remember from episode 13, back in season 2 of the podcast. Mike is a consultant and food futurist whose recent book, Mise, spelled M-I-S-E, offers up 4 big-picture scenarios for how food and technology might converge in the coming decades. As a self-proclaimed NASA nerd, Mike was super excited to join Robb for this illuminating conversation with Roger Forsgren. Invisible Machines is produced in partnership with OneReach.ai. Their Generative Studio X platform is the only orchestration platform that's been named a leader by every major analyst group. Enterprises and other organizations are already using GSX to create technology ecosystems where they can grow their own digital teammates, called intelligent digital workers. These IDWs can be set to work with hundreds of customizable skills utilizing GSX's no-code building tools. Head to OneReach.ai to test drive an IDW and experience the next phase of generative AI.
Really looking forward to this talk. We have so many questions. Mike, you're a NASA nut like me.
Yeah. It was funny. I was recently having a conversation with a colleague about space food. My work comes in, I work on food innovation and things like that. And he was mentioning to me that apparently at NASA, there's 200 and some odd food items that are approved to be on any sort of spacecraft, right? And he said that apparently they also those items haven't changed since the moon landing. Which kind of shocked me for just imagining that, you're going up into the space station now and you're only allowed to eat these certain foods. But, whether or not that's fully true or not, I think it just kind of made me think of an interesting thing is it's like NASA is kind of known for pushing boundaries, right? And this links back to knowledge management. And I was thinking how do you kind of balance this idea of sticking with what works versus challenging conventions, right? It made me wonder about the food thing, what other things inside of NASA are kind of supposedly fixed in that same way, if anything? And how do you kind of decide, when to change something from scrambled eggs to, launch protocol or something like that? So that was sort of the tangent that kind of launched me into this, but I just remember being kind of flabbergasted by that. I was like, wow, those menu items haven't changed. It's interesting to me.
It is interesting. And it kind of reminds me, Gene Kranz, he was a famous NASA project manager. And he gave 2 quotes. And if you saw Tom Hanks's Apollo 11 movie, and we recall him telling his group of engineers that failure is not an option. But Gene Kranz also said, "No, you can't accomplish anything without taking a risk." So there's 2 ends of the spectrum right there. Do you take risks, or is failure not an option? And I always thought that that's the kind of challenge that NASA has. Maybe it's because we're a government agency and we're so visible and there's so much tax dollars put into us that you start to become a little bit too conservative, and you're especially after a disaster like the Columbia tragedy and the Challenger tragedy. You're almost, the taxpayers are furious, the government, Congress is furious, and you just tend to get a little bit scared to do anything after something like that. So I think there's a real balance that you have to take, and I think NASA management, particularly in the last, I would say 15, 20 years, has done a real good job. I would say after the Columbia accident, and a lot of things were changed at NASA. The culture was changed. They brought about a dissenting opinion policy where people on a project team were required to, speak up if they have a problem or if they see a problem. And I think NASA, especially because it's a government agency, is always going to be somewhat conservative in nature. And also because it's all engineers, and I think engineers are conservative by nature. Now, if something works, you stick with it. But occasionally, you got to come along and do something innovative. And I think that's the real value at NASA. That there's a lot of research being done, and there's a lot of people that come to NASA because it's NASA, and we do cool stuff. They want to make things even more profound and more interesting.
Yeah,
they just tend to have a culture like that. I don't know about the food for the astronauts.
Apparently not in food choices. I think a lot of people, imagine that innovation comes from like new ideas, but they're really just ideas that are built upon the shoulders of other ideas. And if your role was to, like, in a way, institutionalize the existing ideas, giving like a launch pad, to use the analogy, for new ideas, you need to know what the old ideas are, the lessons that were learned, so that new ideas can be born from like not repeating old mistakes. And that seems like an ominous challenge. Like if you're brought in to sort of be in charge of knowledge, it just feels like Yoda being brought in to, like, to be the all-knowing being. Like, how did you approach that when you first got there?
I was kind of overwhelmed. I mentioned this in the book. I was studying up on knowledge management. I tried to attend a couple of forums and lectures, read books on it. But to be honest with you, it didn't do a whole lot for me. I was a little bit too academic based, I guess.
Yeah.
I was looking for a program that was much more practical and something that could help the technical workforce at NASA, because they're really the boots on the ground for the agency. The agency's huge. I think it has 18,000 civil servant employees, and along with another like 60,000 contractors. So it's a big agency. And people that make the James Webb Space Telescope, the people that do the design work and engineering work, assembly work, machining work on it, those are the people that I think we wanted to focus on, because they really are the bread and butter of the agency. I'm not saying that the other facets of the agency aren't important. There's, of course, there's budget and finance and schedule, and there's procurement and all these other different organizations that are all critical. But in order to just kind of get a handle on knowledge management at a place like NASA, we just had to kind of focus on the technical workforce and just see what the needs were and how we can help them.
Yeah, that was like the three things I really took away from your book that were empowering from my standpoint, because knowledge management as a system at NASA is world class. And I was going, well, there are three things that really hit me. One was, don't boil the ocean, like, try to break it into a reasonable chunk versus like becoming an expert on semantics. The second was, who's it for? Not just knowledge for everyone, which is such a UX philosophy. Pick a persona, and then probably the most important piece was, what is the critical information for that person or that group of people, and focus on that critical information versus all the information at NASA and trying to boil that into something useful. I was like, wow, those three things. I'm not sure that would have happened with somebody who was an academic in semantics and language. I think they go after boil the ocean over and over and over again. I see that, let's get all of our knowledge in one place and get it all searchable versus let's focus on more the critical pieces of information and for specific people that would benefit from it and start measuring that. And I found that super interesting. I'm sure you got some pushback when you started.
Well, to be honest with you, I didn't. NASA had changed a lot after the Columbia tragedy. And what was it? It was pretty much demanded by Congress and the president. The space shuttle program was put on hold for almost 2 years. And then it was, going to be mothballed after a couple more flights after the ISS was finished being built. So I think management came in there, and I can give you a demonstration of why I think management was important. Is they put knowledge management and engineering training in the office of the chief engineer at headquarters.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't know that.
What tells the workforce that management considers knowledge management and their training more important than doing, moving us into the office of the chief engineer? Because the chief engineer at NASA, if you talk about Yoda or somebody that really understands engineering and success and risk and failure, this is NASA chief engineer, and he's the last word on sending up human flights, space shuttles up in space, making sure that everything is correct. So the person has an awful lot of responsibility, and I think to put knowledge management under the chief engineer demonstrates NASA's upper management dedication to knowledge management and training.
To be honest, I wasn't so familiar with kind of knowledge management as a discipline before I kind of started prepping for this call. However, I've worked at large organizations and things like that, and with clients, I've been sort of a recipient of the output of good or bad knowledge management. But I'm curious from your point of view, if you're an engineer at NASA, what does it feel like for that person's day-to-day experience if you've got good knowledge management versus bad knowledge management?
I think it's real important. I think we've proved our worth over the years. The interesting thing about knowledge management in an engineering environment like NASA, I've been at NASA for 38 years, and I've met some really smart people and dedicated people. And when you look at the mistakes that's happened, if you look at Challenger and Columbia, if you look at the Hubble Space Telescope, things like that, it's very seldom is it an engineering mistake. Somebody didn't, calculate something wrong. It's never that. We're always good with our analytics, and we're always good with the math, but it's a decision-making process, and it's a human process that is, almost always the root cause of, certainly of Challenger and certainly of Columbia, certainly of the Hubble Space Telescope. We get our engineering down pat, but the interesting thing with engineering and NASA is that sometimes really, really smart people make really bad mistakes, make really bad decisions. And that's, I think, for me, I think that's the most useful way to deal with knowledge management at NASA, but it's also kind of terrifying because if you put yourself, I don't think engineers like to deal with the human side. They're much more comfortable, with the numbers and with the nuts and bolts and with the machinery and stuff like that. But when you bring in the human aspect to a decision-making process, I think that's a thing that could be kind of terrifying. And if you put, if you study up on certainly Columbia or Challenger, and you put yourself in the shoes of the people that made those bad decisions, and these people are smart. I mean, they're really smart, but they were under some pressures that you're unaware of, and they had some variables that, for their way of thinking that just led them down the wrong path, and they made a mistake. And I think that, to me, that's that's how you can learn from them. But it's also, maybe you can learn it because it's so terrifying. If you put yourself in that position, you think, oh my God, I might have gone ahead and said, go ahead and launch.
Yeah.
And I think that, to me, that's how an engineer learns, but it's also, a little bit on the frightening side as from an engineering standpoint, looking at it through a human standpoint.
Yeah. I know as human beings, we tend to have a harder time noticing the absence of things versus the presence of things, especially when it comes to problems. And if knowledge management's doing its job, it's an absence of problems. And so it's one of those things hard to get credit for its value when it was just the absence of a problem or the absence of somebody not knowing key information. I've heard you talk a little bit about the metric system versus imperial mishap. I don't know if you want to explain for everybody that whole scenario.
There was a Mars probe. It was a $1 billion program. It was back in the 1990s. It was when NASA in the United States was first getting interested again in going back to Mars, but they needed to survey it. So they developed this probe, and I believe part of it was made in Colorado, and the other part was managed out of JPL in California. And I believe it was the JPL group that managed the project, and they were all dealing with English units. And while the company that was building the probe out in Colorado was dealing in metric units. And I mean, that is something, what could be more simple? I mean, to make sure you're both engineering groups are talking on the same language, but they weren't. And they launched the probe and started to hit they noticed that on the trajectory to Mars at JPL, they noticed that when they put in, their directions for thrusters to go or whatever to move it, it would be further away than they thought it was. And they were all constantly correcting it, till it got to, into Mars orbit. But what they didn't realize is that it was designed for metric units, and they were plugging in English units, and 1 inch isn't 1 millimeter. It's
right.
Significantly different. So, and they still didn't realize this until they were hoping to go in for a landing on Mars, and it just kind of swung by Mars and flew back out, and it was never recovered. They never knew what happened to it. And afterwards, they did obviously a accident committee took a look at it and realized that the project had gone this long with one group doing metric and one group doing English. And I think from a knowledge standpoint, you look at that as, of course, human, but it's essentially human, but it's a matter of communication and miscommunication. And how many problems do you have that are actually just because of misunderstandings or miscommunication? And I think this is an example of this Mars probe, certainly one on steroids, but just even simple discussions that fellow team members may have. There's can be a little bit of a misunderstanding, or even an email, somebody phrases something, where there's a little bit of misunderstanding on the recipient's side. And how much of that is, part of understanding disasters and problems and things like that. Knowledge management can, hopefully can help other people understand that.
Yeah, I think the key is, like you said, if senior management is behind it, then the need to be constantly, justifying the absence of problems becomes less critical. But then something happens like that, and it almost seems like something like that has to happen for senior management to care. And we're in this loop of the disaster has to happen for the right people to care, and then they care. Who knows? Was there a limited time they cared for, and did it kind of fade over time, or did it stay at the top of the priority list?
It definitely stayed at the top, and that's one of the case studies we use. But you had mentioned something earlier, just a few minutes ago, about knowledge management not getting the kind of credit because you have a successful project and you did your job as far as a knowledge manager, and people understand, the importance of communication, the importance of, proper decision making, and they do this project. And everybody thinks, well, why do we have a project manager? Everything's going perfect. And I think a perfect example of this is the International Space Station. If you look at this, this is the biggest man-made project in the history of the world. It's the most expensive ever, $120 billion. And you don't hear about it because it's been working flawlessly, for 20 some years. And so somebody would come back and say, well, what do we need knowledge management for? Obviously we're doing a great job, and we don't need it on a project like this. But I think it's the subtle part that knowledge management can do in a project and to a project team that makes something like the ISS so successful, and hundreds of other projects at NASA. The problem with knowledge management is the same thing with training. It's not quantifiable.
Right. The ROI is in the absence of problems.
Exactly. And every year you go through a budget cycle at NASA, and every year you got to justify your thing. And I could never go in there and say, well, I saved the agency $3 billion because of the knowledge management training program. Because I don't have any data. It's just not quantifiable. Although I think everybody understands a well-trained workforce is going to be better than, is going to be productive and efficient and effective. But I can't say that, I saved so many, dollars for the government. So I think to try to quantify our success at NASA, instead of return on investment, we talked about return on mission success. What we do is we would, and this is the only kind of metric I could present to the chief engineer. I couldn't, say, like I said, I can't say we saved $100 million on this project, $10 million on this, but I could say we spoke to the project manager on this project, and they came back and said that the people from his team that went to our course came back more motivated and did a better job on their, on their daily jobs, or they took a communication course and they came back and they knew how important it is to be precise when you're writing an email, especially over something technical, so that people understand it. And so what we did is gather metrics from managers and also from people that attended our courses and our forums, and got their feedback and used that as a metric for ourselves.
Roger, how does knowledge management try to impact culture within an organization like NASA?
That's a great question.
Role of culture in kind of helping with decision making, right?
Yeah. Actually, I think one of the prime uses that knowledge management can have for upper management is in helping shape an organization's culture. And I say help, because knowledge management alone isn't going to change any organization's culture. It takes upper management. But what upper management has to do, if they're interested in change management, and they're interested in developing a new kind of culture, I think lean knowledge management is a perfect tool for upper management, because it gives them access to their workforce. And at NASA, it gave the chief engineer or anybody on the 9th floor at headquarters, if they wanted to attend or present at a knowledge management forum, it gave them a face-to-face interaction with people on the shop floor. And I think that's the huge value that knowledge management has. And I think it's overlooked in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, one thing I really connected with was not just the pull of knowledge. Like, we always think of knowledge management as, you have a question, I'll give you an answer, but the push of knowledge. And one of the areas you talked about was the weakness of engineers, like empathy. Like, if you could extend their education by a year, it would be all around empathy and teaching them how to like talk to other humans versus how to talk to rockets and machines. So 4 years or whatever it is of talking to rockets, and then 1 year of talking to humans, because that really matters. And the idea that knowledge should be about pushing knowledge, and that the types of knowledge you can train on isn't just ones and zeros or inches and centimeters, but also like how to be a human being.
Exactly, yeah. And I mentioned this in the book briefly, but when I first became in charge of knowledge management and training, I hosted a forum down at the Kennedy Space Center. And I invited leading professors from a bunch of American engineering schools, and also a couple from Europe. And the whole focus of it was a 3-day forum. And I wanted to find out if they had the opportunity to make engineering a 5-year degree, what would they teach in that 5th year? Because, and I explained, the engineers we get from Ohio State or Michigan or any Alabama, any American college, they know they're engineering. They're really good engineers. But what could you make them as not only better engineers, but maybe better managers, maybe better people? And it was unanimous. There was 3 things. Learn how to communicate correctly, because engineers are notorious for not being able to communicate efficiently and effectively. The other one would be critical thinking skills, kind of instead of looking at a problem always from a math background, maybe to look at a broader picture to find out, maybe there's something deeper involved with the problem. And the other thing was engineering ethics and how important their role is, not only to their organization, but to society in general. My wife doesn't know how to turn the TV on, but there's an engineer somewhere that designed this. I mean, robust, beautiful TV, just LCD TV that's just fantastic. But most of the people don't understand how things work, don't understand how their cell phone works, don't understand a lot, and they rely a lot on engineers. And I got to give engineers a lot of credit. And I think at NASA, that's when it comes to engineering ethics, I think that has become hopefully, and this is part of the culture change at NASA, has become ingrained in project teams because of something called dissenting opinion, where, and this is what we try to stress, if you're on a project team, especially if it's human spaceflight, you see something you don't like, and you're questioning it, you have a moral obligation to raise your hand in a meeting and say, either I don't understand this, or I think there's a problem here. That this could be, could be a big problem further down the road in this project. You have a moral obligation to make sure that your voice is heard. And I think this is the lesson that is learned from challenge.
Yep.
Engineers were told to take off their engineering hat, put on their management hat, go with the flow, and forget about the engineering. Well, something as complex as chivalry, something as complex as designing a TV or a cell phone, you never take off your engineering.
Yeah. Roger, you go there in, that's a good segue to, I read your paper, The Architecture of Evil, which I highly recommend to anyone. It's so fascinating of a story, and I think it hits kind of the nail onto the head right there. Could you kind of go into a little bit about what that paper is about and how that relates to engineering ethics?
Sure. And actually, that paper, that was published by New Atlantis magazine probably about 10 years ago. And I've updated it, and I've written a second book for STEM students and STEM professionals, and I've included that as a case study. As a little, my first degree was in history. I've always been fascinated by German history and World War II. And even as a little kid, Albert Speer always struck me as so different. He's in this regime of just absolute criminals.
He was the chief architect of the Nazi Party, right?
Yes, he was the chief architect. And then after the war started, he became the armaments minister. And he was an incredible engineer. He's been credited, I'm not sure that's the right word, but a lot of historians believe because of his effectiveness as an armaments engineer and dealing with efficiencies, he was able to prolong World War II actually an extra year, even though Germany was being bombed constant day and night by Americans and the British, and manufacturing facilities, things like that were being wiped out. He was, through his brilliance, he was able to keep their war machine going. But I always found the man interesting because there seemed such a dichotomy that he would, and he came from a good family. He had a real good education, but somehow he was such a thorough engineer that he wasn't interested in ethics or morality. Because for an engineer, ethics and engineers like black and white. They like 1-0 on off. They want to understand laminar flow. Anything that is in a gray area is real problematic for an engineer, because there's no absolute answer. And I think that was a lot of Albert Speer's issues, is that confusing areas where there are no definitive answers, I think he just would avoid. And morality, I think, is obviously one of those areas.
Yeah.
He allowed himself, despite a good education, a good background, and he's a good family man, allowed himself to get intertwined with these criminals and worked his way up the ladder, and was doing things for the Nazi regime. And he didn't really face the responsibilities for it until the Nuremberg trials, and until he spent time in 20 years in prison, where he got actually had the time to think about what he had done. And I think at the end he realized what kind of basically what a tragic figure he had been. And
Wow.
I'm always interested in it. I think from an engineering standpoint, I think he is the absolute example of why engineering ethics and morality is important.
Yeah.
Because
I want
engineers are capable of doing a whole lot of stuff, and if they don't have that moral backbone to say, you know what, I'm not really interested in designing something like that, or I think this could be
yeah.
Not proper or not moral.
Yeah.
They have to have the background.
I think there's two sides. Designers as well. We find that a lot of like product designers will design things that are not sustainable, and they're just after beauty, and you realize that most of the things that are designed that are not sustainable, there was a designer behind it that wasn't thinking about those things, and the design community as a whole doesn't really take as much responsibility for what they're creating. Same with engineering, like they team together for kind of where we are in the world in terms of the non-sustainable things that we have, because they thought, well, the phone's just going to look more beautiful this way, even if it means it's going to get thrown away. And I think engineering design, there's a whole ethics component, and now we're into AI, where the consequences could be even greater for that kind of thinking. How did you guys kind of bring it front and center? Like, what did you do at NASA to kind of try to at least surface the concept of ethics in engineering?
It was definitely case studies, and I think obviously those both space shuttle disasters can be talked about from an ethics standpoint, engineering ethics. But also, if you look at the Ford Pinto, and that's kind of a classic engineering ethics case study, where a designer had to make a decision. They had to figure out, basically what they valued a human life as. And I think this probably with the help of some lawyers too. But they decided that, well, if we save $2 on this and we make 1 million of these products, we're going to save $2 million, and let's go ahead and go this route, even though it might be a little bit more dangerous. And the other one, case study, and again, my second book is all about case studies, and there's a chapter on engineering ethics. It had to do with Dieselgate and Volkswagen. And, a lot of times you think, well, how often does an engineer really have to deal with a real ethical question? And here's one. I mean, it wasn't that long ago either, where engineers decided, well, we're going to design a software bug in our car, that when the government goes to check to see what kind of pollution, carbon dioxide comes out of it, or carbon monoxide comes out of it, it's going to fool the tester. It's going to shut off a valve here and there, and so it's only showing half of how much it's actually polluting. And it was purposely designed by an engineer to do that, to fool these pollution detectors. And you have to understand, if you're an engineer and you're faced with doing something like that, and your boss is telling you, I'll give you a promotion if you figure out a way to get us to sell these cars in California. And you think, well, I can outsmart a EPA testing machine and those that had that kind of software. That's some serious ethical issues that engineers have to understand. I think case studies are the best way to, to share that, because it really puts an engineer, again, it puts them in that engineer's shoes, thinking, oh, wow, what would I have done? Somebody promised me a promotion. Would I possibly have gone along with that? Or it gets kind of scary, I think.
Yeah. As an engineer, I get obsessed with the problem, and sometimes I get lost in the problem and the desire to solve it instead of thinking about should I.
Yeah.
Roger, there's this old mythology about Steve Jobs about saying when he was working on big product launches like the iPhone and stuff like that, he'd divide up all the different departments that are working on it, and they would just work on the speaker or the screen, but not really know how the whole thing kind of added up. I imagine there's maybe some degree of that at an organization as large and sprawling as NASA. Like, how do you kind of balance that dynamic of keeping engineers focused on the problem of the component they're working on, but still understanding what the whole thing is adding up to? Because I think that seems to be kind of a little bit where ethical quandaries can hit, right? I'm making a screen for something, but what is it in service of, right?
Hopefully there isn't a lot of that at NASA, because I think that could be kind of dangerous. And I think that's probably where systems engineering comes in, where there's an engineer that has to be aware of all these different components and has to, make sure that they're all testing correctly and they all can work together and they can all fit together in the same box. So I really think that's a system, and systems engineering has always been critical at NASA. We had an entire curriculum designed right around developing good systems engineers throughout the agency. But I think probably in the early phases of a project, like a phase A, where it's just pretty much researchers working on something and the engineers aren't involved too much. They're coming up with the ideas of a probe to develop or an experiment to design. The engineers probably aren't involved in that, and it's mostly researchers. And then that's where all hell breaks loose, when the researchers come to the engineering team and say, "Okay, here's what we want, build it." And the engineers are like, "This is impossible. We can't build this. This is, we have to negotiate here." Sometimes researchers and engineers have to learn how to collaborate a little bit like that. But I think that's the only instances I think at NASA where I saw that kind of process.
How did you work that, to maintain knowledge, you got to get cooperation from those who consume it, those who produce it. You can't just have a centralized team of all-knowing people. How did you get the sort of cooperation from let's call it your audience, the folks that were consuming the knowledge, to keep it up to date and to give you feedback when it was wrong?
That's a great question. That's the kind of question that when I was appointed Chief Knowledge Officer, I asked our team, how are we going to maintain this? And I think the best way we learned to do that was to make our knowledge forums and make our training interesting, make it something that an engineer would find fascinating, and they'd also learn something from it, and they'd want to attend it, they'd want to learn from it. I think, and none of our training or none of our forums were compulsory. They were all voluntary, and to be honest with you, I don't think I ever canceled I know I never canceled a knowledge management forum, and very infrequently did I ever cancel a course because of low attendance. We always had people that were interested in it, and it's just the way you present, knowledge and training to folks. And I know that engineers, just by nature, prefer learning by case studies, and like I mentioned before, putting themselves in that situation, trying to figure out, what would they have done. It becomes much more personal.
Yeah, I think the thing that grabs me the most is this idea of, I think a lot in push versus pull. And I find in the AI world now, we're all focused on, oh, look, I asked it a question and it answered. I said this kind of earlier, but it seemed like you instinctively just took this role on very quickly realizing like pushing knowledge is key to success, not just pulling and gathering it all, but that you were offering knowledge to people that could come and gather. You were proactive about it, and that's huge.
Yeah, and I think part of it is changing the culture. And like I said, I think I don't take credit for NASA's major culture change after Columbia, but I do think we helped change it. And we helped change it from an organization where if you make a mistake, you get punished, or do you want to be an organization where you make a mistake and you learn from it? And I think NASA's, and we would interview project managers and even upper management and ask them, what was your best mistake? What was the mistake you made along in your career that you learned the most from? And, really, and I remember the chief engineer had a quote, something about, as human beings, most of the time we learn the most from the mistakes we make rather than our successes.
Yeah.
That always rung true to me, because it's when you do make a mistake where you sit back and you think, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. Or, if you're continuing launching and everything, this is what scares me about SpaceX and I live right in Florida and I watch their launch, and sometimes they launch 2 or 3 times a week. It's really phenomenal. And I give them a ton of credit. But oftentimes what happens with a human being is that you're real successful and all of a sudden you kind of get like a little bit lackadaisical and you get kind of overconfident maybe.
Yeah.
In the system. I don't have any dealings with SpaceX, and I'm sure Elon Musk is smart enough to realize this. But to me, when you're having a really successful program or project like that, that's when you really got to start studying it, because that's when you kind of get a little bit too laid back, a little bit too, arrogant maybe, and thinking that we've done this 100 times, the 101st time will be no problem. But I think that's the kind of attitude. And again, it's shook showing that mistakes at NASA and the engineering world are seldom made because of faulty analytics. It's always done because of faulty decision. That there's a human connection to it.
Yeah, you said you don't have any affiliation with SpaceX, but I'm curious if you're privy to, ever since kind of SpaceX coming out on the scene, has NASA changed as a result of that presence being out there?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and I don't have any inside information of how upper management at NASA is thinking, but I think with SpaceX and Elon Musk, and also you got Blue Origin on the side, Bezos' company, and they're developing these reusable rockets, and NASA has the engineering. I mean, we could do that if we wanted to, or if we permitted to, rather. But when you're an organization that's bound up in politics and Congress, and your budget's relying on Congress approval, well, you got to get the approval of every single congressman, and half the time you have to do that by putting a machine shop in Iowa and another machine shop out in California, another part supplier in New York and stuff like that, in all these different districts. And then you're kind of, and this is what happened after the space shuttle program, was basically Congress told NASA how to design, SLS, the new launch system, and they had to reuse former components of the, for cost reasons, had to use former components of the space shuttle. And I think if you gave NASA engineers a blank sheet back then, I don't think they would have designed it like that. I give them a lot of credit.
They figured it out,
years ago, but it's not the ideal way to design something. Where Elon Musk and Blue Origin and SpaceX, they have that opportunity to start from scratch and make a reusable rocket, not have to worry about pleasing some congressman out in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
you can just build it the way an engineer would want to build it.
Yeah,
it's so profound to think that bureaucracy kind of prevent, because you're right, NASA has all the same talented engineers. Many of them probably went over to SpaceX. Like, it's not lack of talent, it's just the incentive structure and the constraints of that.
That's
crazy. Something interesting to pause on.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and that's why that senior leadership is so critical, because you do get mired, and someone's got to unblock you. I think in the AI space, I think there's a lot of tools now. Knowledge management is cool, and now everyone's talking about it, and many companies are wishing they had curated knowledge management repositories like you eventually had, and they're all trying to figure out how to get there. And it's kind of exciting time, in my opinion, because something that was sort of relegated as sideline is now like in the forefront, and might be just the key to success for a lot of companies in a upfront sort of way. One of the biggest benefits I see after reading your book and talking to you was that a lot of the human component, the cost and the labor of trying to get this done can hopefully be facilitated by AI now, and the management of it. But what's more interesting to me on the cost side is just by taking your approach, just by doing lean knowledge management, you already just focus on who and the critical knowledge, and focus on training versus, customer service or answering questions, because you don't know what questions you're going to answer. You have this like broad, I don't know what people might ask. And so if it's answer a question from anybody on any subject, it's huge, versus working on a curriculum, focusing on training, making training an area that is AI enabled. And then essentially you're answering the question before it's asked, which is so much smarter. Sorry, that wasn't a question.
Well, you brought up an interesting concept of utilizing AI and knowledge management. And I think there are some, obviously some huge opportunities there. I also think that you're also going to take I'm not an expert in AI, but I think you're also going to have a human there to kind of help filter.
Yeah.
I'll give you an interesting story. This is probably about 10 years ago. We had some researchers at NASA, and this is before AI became, it's such a key component of almost every article you read nowadays. But they came to us, and they've been experimenting and developing a search engine that they thought NASA researchers would be able to utilize. And
Okay.
they were giving us an example. If you type in a technical term and to do a Google search on it, you'll get 2,000 hits, and you got to go. A researcher's got to waste their time and go through every one, filtering out ones. Well, they developed a system that would do that for you, and it really sounded interesting. And I met with their team and talked to them. But now we're lean knowledge management back then, and I understand where they were coming from. And they gave they gave us an example where they showed 2,000 Google hits, and then they typed into their search engine the same term and found some obscure document in a German university somewhere that was exactly perfect what this researcher was looking for. But at the same time, the search engine they developed it was so complex. It had like four programmers that had to work with the researcher just to make sure they got the right term into their search engine and stuff like that. And it was obviously highly expensive that way. And we were lean knowledge management. And I said, hey, if I had a $10 million more budget, I'd be more than happy to kind of pursue this. But I have to stay focused on my audience. And NASA management and the federal government isn't funding me to fund your experiments, even though it has a lot of future value, and could become a real opportunity in the future. I have to help the NASA technical workforce, and that's the only people that I'm concerned about. And I'm lean knowledge management. When your product is more mature and it doesn't take 4 programmers to do it, and I can just type something in right from my desktop, come back and we'll talk. And those are the kind of tough decisions I think you had to go through with lean knowledge management. Is really just, and these weren't the first folks that came to me looking to help, of course, but also looking for funding. NASA libraries were the same way. What's more knowledge management than a library? But libraries are kind of, I hate to say it, but we all know they're kind of outdated.
Right.
When you have a question, the first thing you do is run to your local library. It's get on your laptop and do a search that way. And I just you just have to focus on your audience, and I think that's very knowledge management.
Roger, I'm curious. It seems like over the last 50 years, and then looking ahead 50 years, the human relationship with knowledge is just becoming more and more fluid, right? Like in the old school days, you had to go to the library and Dewey Decimal System something, and knowledge was kind of slow. Now we've got Google, and you could go a little bit quicker, but you still got to dig around to find the right pages, the right keywords, or something like that. And I think about, I have a 3-year-old daughter. I think about her generation, and by the time she gets to be of working age, AI LLMs is going to make that even more fluid, where you might not even have to search through a whole page rank of listings. You just kind of type into a box, and then it spits out the answer, right? So I think a lot about people of her generation coming into places like NASA. How do you think that's going to change how you approach knowledge management when there's a generation of engineers and workers who just expect knowledge to just erupt out of a box instantly,
It really is amazing. Look how far we've come. You look at the Apollo program, going back to the moon in the 1960s. This was before they even had fax machines.
Right.
How do you design a Saturn V rocket, without a laptop? And all the calculations, everything was done by hand. It really is a phenomenal piece of history, not only from an American standpoint, but from an engineering standpoint. And what the future holds is, who knows? I know that my father, in his lifetime, he told me one time, I was born before they, right around when the Wright brothers created the first airplane, and he lived to see him land on the moon. I mean, in his lifetime. And if you think, for us, knowledge management and AI, it sounds absolutely exciting, a little bit terrifying too, but who knows how much more efficient and effective we'll be. But again, maybe you can come back to the engineering ethics side of it and think, this is a tool that can do a whole lot of good, a whole lot of bad too. Somebody has to be able to have draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going past that.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. Really appreciate you coming on. I hope we can do this again as we see this mature in the world. I think, I personally found your book super helpful. Lean UX is right on. And I think your point of it's got to be simple, or else it's just not going to work. I 100% agree with. And being simple means start small and be focused on what you're doing. So love it. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, sure.
This was great.
Yeah, Roger, thank you so much. As a fellow fan of NASA nerd, super interesting to talk to you.
And thanks, Mike, for co-hosting.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining this ongoing conversation about conversational AI. Be sure to subscribe to Invisible Machines wherever you get your podcasts, and if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review on the Apple Podcast app. You can also watch these conversations on the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. This podcast is produced for UX Magazine in partnership with OneReach.ai. Over the past 5 years, our team of nearly 200 engineers, scientists, experienced designers, anthropologists, and linguists have been developing Generative Studio X, an award-winning platform that has the lone distinction of being named a leader by every major analyst group. GSX is a complete environment for hosting, creating, analyzing, and scaling your own digital teammates called Intelligent Digital Workers. For an interactive demo of IDWs in action and to learn more about the GSX platform, head to OneReach.ai. This podcast would not be possible without the hard work and dedication of executive producer Elias Parker and producer Kate Timchenko. Our video and audio editor is Michael Litvinov, and we rely on support from the marketing team at OneReach.ai, including Allison Harshberger, Anastasia Nechtalio, and Vera Prokodko. Thanks again, and we look forward to connecting with you next week, right here on Invisible Machines.